You tried to explain, not to defend yourself, not to convince anyone, just to make things clearer. You thought that if you added context, the tension would ease. You chose your words carefully. You explained your intentions. You filled in the gaps so nothing would be misunderstood. It seemed reasonable. Explaining usually helps. At first, no one stopped you. You were listened to. You were allowed to finish. On the surface, it looked like the right thing to do. But something changed as you spoke. The more you explained, the heavier the moment became. Faces tightened, the tone shifted. What started as clarification began to feel like justification. You noticed how explanations were received differently than statements. Saying what happened felt neutral. Explaining why it happened felt uncomfortable. You weren't arguing, you weren't pushing, you were trying to be understood. Still, the room didn't relax. It grew more tense, as if adding clarity added weight instead of removing it. You stopped mid-sentence more than once. You sensed it wasn't landing the way you expected. You wondered if you had already said too much. Nothing about your explanation was false, nothing was aggressive, but explaining didn't make things better. It made them worse. You noticed how explanations changed the atmosphere. When you spoke briefly, things stayed neutral. When you added reasons, the mood shifted. Not sharply, gradually, as if something had tipped without being named. You saw how people leaned back instead of in, how responses shortened, how attention moved away from what you were saying toward how long you were saying it. You noticed how quickly explanations were reframed. You were told you didn't need to explain, or that it wasn't that serious, or that you were thinking too much about it. You weren't told you were wrong. You were told you were doing too much. You noticed how explanations seemed to invite judgment, not of the facts, but of you, your tone, your intent, your need to clarify. When you stated something simply, it stood on its own. When you explained, it seemed to lose balance. You began to notice when to stop talking. The slight pause, the shift in posture, the moment when clarity stopped helping and started costing. You noticed how often you cut yourself short, how often you said never mind, how often you backed away from finishing a thought. Each instance felt small, each one easy to dismiss, but the pattern was consistent. Explaining didn't reduce misunderstanding. It increased tension. And you were the only one who seemed to notice that difference. The same thing kept happening. You would explain with the intention of settling things. You would add context so nothing would be assumed. You would slow down and make room for understanding. And the situation would tighten. Not every time. Often enough. You noticed how explanations were treated as something extra, as if they added weight instead of clarity, as if they introduced a problem that hadn't been there before. You began to recognize the moment it turned, the point where the explanation stopped being information and started being read as justification. You hadn't been accused, but you were responding as if you had. You noticed how explanations shifted attention away from what had happened and toward why you felt the need to explain it. The focus moved, quietly. Over time, you learned what followed. Shorter responses, a cooler tone, a sense that things needed to be wrapped up. You noticed how rarely explanations were met with curiosity, how often they were met with impatience or reassurance or dismissal. Each time, you adjusted. You told yourself to be clearer, to be shorter, to explain better next time. But the outcome stayed the same. Explaining didn't bring relief. It brought scrutiny. And that kept repeating. You started changing how much you said. Not because you had less to explain, because you had learned what explaining seemed to do. You learned to pause sooner, to stop before giving too much context. You began to offer shorter answers. You trimmed details that felt relevant to you. You chose what might land instead of what felt complete. You noticed how often you prepared explanations in advance, not to argue, to prevent misunderstanding before it happened. You thought ahead. You rehearsed quietly. When you sensed tension, you rushed to clarify. When you sensed impatience, you pulled back. You tried to read the moment before deciding how much to say. You learned to explain just enough, not too little, not too much. Enough to keep things moving. Sometimes you stopped yourself mid-explanation. You felt the shift and adjusted on the fly. You changed direction. You softened the point. You wrapped it up quickly. You told yourself this was being considerate, that not everything needed to be explained, that people didn't always want the full picture. You noticed how much effort this took, how much attention went into managing your own clarity. You were still trying to be understood, just more carefully than before. And over time, explaining stopped feeling like communication. It started feeling like risk. Living this way began to take something from you. You noticed how often you held back information that felt relevant, not because it wasn't true, because you didn't want the moment to tighten again. You felt the weight of deciding what to leave out. You filtered yourself in real time. You chose what might be tolerated instead of what felt accurate. You noticed how explanations stayed active in your mind even when you didn't say them. You carried the full version silently. You spoke the shortened one. Over time, this created a split. What you knew, what you said, what you kept to yourself. You became more careful than you wanted to be, not guarded, measured. You watched how much space your words took up. You worried about sounding defensive when you were only being thorough. You noticed how quickly you took responsibility for tension. If something felt off, you assumed you had explained too much, or not well enough, or at the wrong time. You felt yourself shrinking your presence, not disappearing, just making it easier for others by taking up less room. You didn't call this loss. You told yourself you were learning restraint, that not everything needed explanation. But something was changing. You felt less clear inside conversations, less grounded. You noticed how relief came not when you were understood, but when the explanation was over. That was new, and you hadn't named what it was costing you. There was one thing you eventually saw. The explanations were never really the problem. You weren't over-explaining because you liked to talk. You were explaining because something felt unstable, because clarity didn't hold on its own anymore. You noticed how often you explained before being asked, how often you tried to settle something that hadn't been questioned yet. You weren't defending yourself. You were trying to keep things smooth. But the more you explained, the more exposed you felt, not clearer, more visible. As if explaining put you on display instead of bringing understanding. You realized that explanations were being read as something else, as tension, as discomfort, as a sign that something was wrong. So you learned to stop, to say less, to let things remain slightly unclear rather than risk making them heavier. And then the truth settled quietly. The explanations didn't make things worse by accident. They made things worse because they revealed that understanding was never really the goal. When explanations made things worse,